There will never be another programming language. In this video, I'm going to explain why AI tools for developers are cementing the dominance of popular languages like JavaScript and Python. I'm going to be talking about why ChatGPT and Claude are so much better with Python and JavaScript than any other languages. I'm going to be talking about why it's so difficult to integrate a new language into these existing models, and why developers' addiction to using AI is going to make adoption of a new language almost impossible. Let's go. I don't think anyone would dispute the fact that it's technically difficult to build a new programming language from scratch, but that's not really what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about how, in order to have a successful programming language, you really need a lot of people to use it. You need a lot of adoption. What I have up on my screen is responses for the 2024 Stack Overflow Developer Survey. And we can see here a list of the most popular languages amongst the respondents. And unsurprisingly, we see JavaScript at number one, HTML a close second, Python, SQL, all of the heavy hitters that more or less everybody has to use to do web development, and Python just increasingly becoming more and more popular with data science, machine learning, people who are learning to code, et cetera, et cetera. Now, let's say that you made a new programming language that was going to run in the browser. You made a JavaScript competitor, and it's different than JavaScript, but it's just objectively better. It's a lot faster. It's easier to use. The syntax isn't as ugly. You resolve some of the nonsense with JavaScript. You get rid of triple equals, all that good stuff. So your language is objectively better on any metric. It's objectively better. That's not enough to get somebody to switch to it, because they're going to have to put in the time and the energy to learn the language. And not only that, there's a suite of tools and other things that make working with a language easier that don't necessarily exist for your new language yet. You need IDEs, you need forums with questions and answers, you need docs. You need to make it easy for people to actually understand how to use your language, because that stuff already exists, especially for JavaScript and Python. And increasingly, what you need is for your language to be heavily integrated into AI tools, because developers are using AI tools in their workflow more and more. People who are learning to code and developers increasingly use AI to learn languages and to learn new concepts. And further, people are using AI to generate code that they're then running. And if you want to be able to do that, the language needs to be baked into the AI. I went over to Claude and ChatGPT and I sent them this prompt. What programming languages do you know the best? Group the languages into tiers based on how confident you are in them, and list the most confident tiers first. What I'm basically trying to do here is have the AI tell me, what are you the best at? What do you understand the best from all of the programming languages in the world? And if we look at Claude's response, most confident, tier one, Python. It claims it's exceptional with Python, modern Python idioms, blah, blah, blah. Knows JavaScript and TypeScript, SQL. And if we go back over to the survey, what do we see? JavaScript, Python, SQL. Then tier two, where it's very confident, we see Java, C/C++, and Ruby. Oh, Java, C++, Ruby's a little lower. And then again, we'll go to tier three, Go, Rust, PHP, Go, Rust, PHP. And what we're seeing here is not an accident. In fact, I'll ask ChatGPT the exact same thing. What programming language do you know the best? Blah, 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 group them into tiers. GPT 4.0 says that it's extremely confident in Python, JavaScript, SQL, HTML, and CSS. And again, we'll go back to the survey. JavaScript, HTML, Python, SQL. Then tier two is Java, C++, Bash. Tier three is Go, Ruby, PHP, blah, blah, blah. And so these tiers look very similar between GPT and Claude. And not only that, they look very similar to this graph here of the most popular languages for developers in 2024. And this is not an accident. The reason these models understand these languages in the first place is because of all of the stuff they've read about them on the internet, online. Stack Overflow in particular is a big source of training data. Your models, these models that you know and love, they've read through nearly every single thread. They've read through every Python question, every JavaScript question. They've read through the answers. They might even understand which of them are good and bad based on the upvotes. And because of that, they understand these languages very well. And the extent to which they understand each of the languages is highly correlated with the amount of examples they've read during training in each of the languages. And on Stack Overflow, a lot more questions have been asked about Python and JavaScript than COBOL. for instance. And for that reason, the AI is going to reflect that bias. It's going to understand these a lot better. In addition to Stack Overflow, you also have, for established languages like Python and JavaScript, you have very detailed documentation explaining everything you need to know in order to use the language across different versions, on different platforms, all of that kind of stuff. You also have third-party tutorials. You have websites like Geeks for Geeks and other things going into more detail, explaining stuff in a different way. You have YouTube videos of people giving tutorials. You have so much information about how these languages work that if in the training process these models are able to read through, soak in, and absorb all the stuff, they're gonna come on the other side with a very good understanding of what's going on. And again, if we look at Google and I look at Python multiprocessing, we see a million different resources for understanding this better. If you were to create a new programming language from scratch, you're not going to have any of this stuff. You're going to have to create it yourself. You're going to need to write good documentation so people know how to use it. You're going to need to go on Stack Overflow and generate these questions and answers to help people get up to speed with the language. But not only that, how do you bake it into the AI? You don't even control GPT or Claude. You're not in control of the training process unless you happen to work at one of those companies. And how often does the training process even happen? Well, these models have what's called a knowledge cutoff. So if we go to this article on Anthropic's support forum, we see that the knowledge cutoff for the earlier Claude models was August 2023, and then Sonnet and Haiku 3.5 were April 2024 and July 2024, respectively. And the knowledge cutoff is the point at which they stop scraping the internet. And so what that means is in all of the training data for Claude 3.5 Haiku, none of it was generated after July 2024. If your language came out in August 2024, then guess what? Claude 3.5 Haiku is not going to know about it and it's not going to be able to help you. It's not clear to me how often these models are going to get updated with new knowledge cutoffs. I know that all of the frontier models, all the companies like OpenAI and Anthropic, they continue to iterate on the models. They want to make them smarter and better. But outside of just making them smarter, at some point it is going to make sense for them to just take the exact same model, the same architecture, the same brains, but update it with new knowledge. And especially for programming languages, you really need to bake it into the model. It's not just enough to go out and grab the docs and paste that into a prompt. And what do I mean by that? Well, let's say that you had documentation for your language, but the model's knowledge cutoff was before you created that documentation. So let's say I wrote some documentation that came out in September 2024, and with Claude, we know that its knowledge cutoff was July 2024 or April 2024. So we know for a fact that Claude doesn't know about my model. But what you could do is something like this. You could start a new chat and you could say like, hey, I have this new programming language. Here are the docs. And then you could do something like copy and paste in a page from your documentation and then ask it a question and say, write me a program to count to 10. And you could do something like this. And that would at least give it a shot at helping you because you're giving it the instructions. But this is very different than having all that knowledge baked in. There's a limited amount of text that you're allowed to paste in here. It's much, much, much lower than the amount of text that these models can be trained on. And not only that, just having the specification is a theoretical concept. The rules for how your language behaves and everything, that stuff is important, but actually running a language on a computer in a real world environment, there's a lot of things that are going to come up that cannot just be mathematically inferred from the specification. And so even if your model is good at reasoning, even if your docs are really good, until there's all those examples of people running into errors on Windows or not being able to install a certain package, it's not going to be nearly as useful as having the stuff actually baked in. And additionally, like I mentioned in a previous video, a lot of developers are continuing to use more and more AI tools in their workflow. And so I have PyCharm here, and I was showing you guys the AI assistant from JetBrains the other day, where you can do stuff like, rewrite this code to be better and send that off to the AI, and then it will give you suggestions. Well, this is a Python project. The AI models, like I mentioned, understand Python very, very well. if you have a new language here, these AI tools are going to be worthless, even if the tools are integrated really well and even if it's really smooth in your IDE, because the language models are not going to understand your new language. They're not going to be able to help you. It doesn't matter how well integrated the AI is if it doesn't even know what you're doing. And for this reason, I think the barrier to entry for creating a new language is much, much higher than it's ever been. I think this trend has been increasing, even just with IDEs. A developer is unlikely to want to take on a new language, even if there are big objective benefits like latency or ease of use, if the tooling is not there, if it's painful for the developer to work with. And now that we're using AI more and more, you need to have AI support for these models to get mass adoption. I don't exactly know how often training is going to be updated, if these knowledge cutoffs can get updated more frequently. I think that would be a key piece for a new language, a new programming language to get mass adoption. The other thing is the data itself. You need a ton of data. It's not just enough for Claude to scrape the internet every month, because if the internet does not contain hundreds of thousands upon millions of examples of how to use your programming language, just scraping the internet is not going to be enough for it to understand. You want your language to be higher on the stack for AI to help. A JavaScript developer probably gets a lot more benefit from AI than a micro Python developer. I don't even know what that is, to be honest. And I doubt a lot of these language models really do either. What would it take for me to be wrong here? What would have to happen in terms of technology, in terms of advancements, for this problem of AI adoption to really go away? And I think the first thing is this knowledge cutoff. If models can get updated more and more frequently, instead of once every year, once every 2 years, that's going to make it much, much easier for new languages to be easily adopted, because instead of having to wait a year and a half or 2 years for the AI to understand anything about your programming languages, perhaps it can start to pull in the knowledge at a more regular interval. I don't know exactly if companies like Anthropic and OpenAI are looking into stuff like this. I assume they are. And I imagine as GPUs get faster and as some of these data pipelines get more and more advanced and streamlined, it is going to become possible to pre-train more and more often and provide updated versions of these models. And assuming that trend continues, depending on how much it continues, that could potentially make my claim that there will never be another programming language less and less true. The other thing is generating the data. I mentioned you have to write documentation, and you also probably need questions and answers like what we have on Stack Overflow. Doing that stuff yourself, writing documentation that's good, is very, very time consuming. It's not easy to do. And generating questions and answers is also something that's very difficult. And that's not something that just one person did for Python and JavaScript. It's literally hundreds of thousands, millions of people over 15 years are why there's so much data. I think that if you wanted to create a new language, you'd have to get clever with generating this data. Just waiting for 15 years for this data to exist because of all these people across the world using it, I don't know that that's going to be a viable option. I do suspect that with AI tools, generating this data will become easier and easier. And you could do something like, I don't know, have the AI write documentation, spit out edits to your documentation. You could hook up, an AI agent and have it run various programs, report the errors, turn it into questions and answers, something like this. But if you don't have the data, it doesn't matter how often the training is happening. If the data is not there, the knowledge will not be there. And I think those are kind of the main things that would make me reconsider my position. And again, my position is that there will never be another programming language. We are stuck in a JavaScript monarchy. Python is the queen, JavaScript is the king. I personally like both of these languages. I know a lot of, especially backend developers, if you write C++, you probably look down on Python and or JavaScript, and I get that. But honestly, these languages are pretty easy to use, and the support really does make it a lot easier. We'll see what happens in the future. I mean, C++ is a heavy hitter. There's a lot of documentation. C++ is not going anywhere, but I would be pretty surprised if in the next 5 years there was a new programming language that was a replacement for Python and or JavaScript. And I don't know that I'll ever see that in my lifetime. I think I'm going to die with JavaScript being the absolute king.